Hi guys.
Harvard, Yale, and Princeton.
I'm not at Harvard as a student. Our offices are there. So I'm not that disgusting. So it's great to come to see, you're in a room of your people when people are bringing their own plates to a free lunch. So hat tip to you guys. My name is Steph Speirs. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Solstice. So just quick survey. How many of you guys have solar on your home? And if you're a student, how many of your parents have solar on your home? Okay. Okay, keep that in mind as we talk more. So Solstice was founded to put solar in the hands of every American. So I'm going to talk about some industry landscape trends, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about community solar. How many of you know what community solar is? Raise your hand. Okay, great. Thanks. So solar is very sexy right now. I don't know if you guys have noticed. People talk about it all the time. And the reason why people talk about it all the time is because the costs have dropped 85% in the last 8 years. It's gotten much, much cheaper recently. And what's really exciting is that this year, 2017, was the first time in history that solar has gotten as cheap as conventional energy in certain parts of the world. It's not true everywhere yet, but even without subsidies, 2017 is the first year in history where solar is as cheap as conventional energy. So before, we couldn't have an honest conversation about how to democratize access to solar because it was too expensive, right? If you had to pay more for solar, that only allows some people to access solar. Right now, for the first time in the history of the world, we're able to have a conversation where if solar is cheap enough that everyone can get it, how do we put it in the hands of everyone? This is a map. It was published by Berkeley scientists in Nature of this year, and it shows where in the country will be hit hardest by climate change. And if you know, what do you guys notice on this map? Yeah, so the South is going to be hit the hardest. The other things these Berkeley researchers found is that the places in the United States that will be hit hardest by climate change are also the poorest areas of the United States. So we talk about how environmental justice is a concept where it's not a matter of whether the clean energy transition will happen. It's a question of whether that transition will be equitable, whether everyone will be able to participate in the green energy revolution. And this is showing you that if we don't do anything about democratizing access to energy, we're only going to exacerbate our inequalities because those hit hardest by climate change are disproportionately poor, low-income households and communities of color. So if you look at studies, communities of color and poor households, they are hit already hardest by climate change, meaning they're hit the hardest by air pollution, they're hit the hardest by natural disasters, and as well as things like asthma rates. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to make this interactive. So this is Paula. She lives in Natick. She's a public school teacher. And she told us, when I saw my neighbor put solar on their roof, I wanted solar too. But when I looked into it, I couldn't get it. And the reason why I couldn't get it is because I can't afford the $30,000 it was going to cost me to put solar on my own home. And it turns out she's not the only one. So in America, 77% of us are locked out of the solar market right now. Almost 4 out of 5 Americans cannot put solar on their own rooftop. And it's for a couple reasons. Maybe you're a renter or a condo owner or a student. Maybe you have structural issues with your roof, so it's facing the wrong way, or it's made out of the wrong materials, or it's a historic building if you live in Boston and you can't change the structure of your roof. And lastly, maybe there's a tree covering your roof. This happens a lot in beautiful Massachusetts where there are trees everywhere. And so that means that 77% of us are locked out of the solar savings that we could get if we could access the solar market. So the good news is there's something called community solar I previewed earlier. Community solar means you don't have to worry about installing anything on your rooftop. You can buy a portion of a neighborhood shared solar farm and switch to solar that way. The electricity from the shared farm will go back to the grid, and you will see a credit show up on your monthly utility bill for the electricity that your solar share produces virtually. So the actual electrons are not going to your home, but you're allowing more solar to be built because you're buying a portion of a shared solar farm. And the cool part is the font's a little messed up because I have a Mac and this is a PC, but this says there's no upfront cost. You save money on your electricity bill every year. Right now, folks are saving 10% off their electricity bill every year. So this is the first way, finally, that people can go solar and access renewable energy without paying more, without worrying about putting something on their roof. And the Department of Energy says it's going to be a huge market. And by 2020, they say that $16 billion will go into building these solar farms. And Solstice's addressable market is $2 billion of that, meaning that's the market for the customer-facing activities for community solar, which I'll talk more about in a bit. That's customer acquisition and customer management. The DOE also says that shared solar could be up to half of solar by 2020. And that is remarkable given that the first community solar farm went into the ground in 2010. There's 16 states across the country that allow for community solar. Massachusetts, Colorado are the two leaders across the country in community solar. But every year, a couple more states have become community solar states, meaning they have laws in place that say that customers can benefit from solar that's not on their own rooftop. They can benefit from solar that's somewhere far away. And recently, just in the past couple of years, New York has been a community solar state, Washington State, Oregon, Minnesota, Maryland, Rhode Island. So this is talked about as the next wave in democratizing access to clean energy. So I'll talk very briefly about Solstice, but I really want to get into this idea of how do we get solar into the hands of low-income Americans. So Solstice has a nonprofit and a for-profit. The for-profit takes care of the whole customer experience for community solar. We use a software platform to do that, and it makes it really easy for people to sign up for solar and to help their friends sign up for community solar as well. So have you guys heard of SaaS businesses, SaaS? This might be, okay. So it's a term that's thrown around a lot in business. It's called software as a service business. We call it solar as a service, right? How do you make solar so easy for people to sign up for it? So our platform basically allows people to go online, see if there's a solar farm in their area, and sign up for one really easily. As if you can imagine, there's no other marketplace that allows you to do that right now. We also allow you to manage your account, see how much your solar share is doing, and you get to pay your bills online. But most importantly, you get to tell your friends and neighbors about solar, and you get to build a community around solar. So there's a Yale study out there that said the #1 reason why people sign up for solar is blank. What do you guys think it is? Yeah, do you know this study? Okay, that's a very accurate, precise answer. So there's a Yale study that said that solar is contagious. The #1 reason why people sign up for solar is because their friend or their neighbor did. More so than the savings, more so than them wanting to do it themselves, the #1 reason is they saw their neighbor do it and they wanted to do it too. Solar is contagious in personal networks, and yet no one has used that to spread solar. And community solar is really the best opportunity to do this because there's no upfront cost, and almost everyone can sign up for it. So it is something that you can spread in your networks. So the Solstice model is we partner with solar project developers. There are thousands of them out there, just alone in Massachusetts, and they're putting solar into the ground. They're building solar. We don't need to be another solar developer. There are a lot of them out there. What they need and what they partner with us for is to take care of the customer experience. Basically, they want to reach households that cannot do rooftop solar, and they need to talk to them hundreds and thousands at a time and manage their account. The skills required to build a solar farm are very different than the skills required to be a good customer interface. And so that's why you'll see solar companies like SolarCity, NRG, name another, SunEdison, all these Sungevity, all these companies that have gone bankrupt in the past couple of years. Do you guys know why they've gone bankrupt? What's their biggest problem? It's actually not hardware costs. That's a good guess. It's soft costs. So it's customer acquisition. It costs SolarCity $3,000 to $6,000 to acquire one rooftop customer. And that's very expensive. That's pretty much the reason why they just laid off 1,000 salespeople, and Tesla actually had to bail out SolarCity because of their financial troubles. So Customer acquisition is a real big problem in residential solar, meaning it's hard to find people that want to put solar on the roof or can put solar on the roof. Because like I mentioned earlier, you have to be kind of a unicorn to put solar on your own rooftop. So we connect these solar developers to hundreds and thousands of customers in their local area. And we manage the customers. We build them, we administer them. And we have financial and customer innovations that allow us to find customers faster, more cheaply at scale than they can. Essentially what we use is the community organizing lessons and the micro-targeting lessons that I learned on the Obama campaign. And we're taking that to solar to learn how to use democratized access to solar. So font's a little weird on this slide, but I want to talk about low-income inclusion. So I mentioned earlier that the people that need solar savings the most, low to moderate income populations, are currently the least likely to get solar. And if you can believe it, community solar was invented so that renters could get access to solar. But up to now, they have only had long-term contracts with cancellation fees, even in community solar. So right now, the product norm in community solar that our solar developer partners are offering is a 20-year contract, often with a cancellation fee. 20 years is a really long time. No one signs up for anything for 20 years anymore, sometimes not even marriage. And so we can't expect people to sign a 20-year contract, right? That's outrageous. And furthermore, low to moderate income families cannot sign a 20-year contract. So what we've spent, I talked about financing innovations that make it easier for customers to get access to solar. Our nonprofit works on low-income access. So there are two problems here: long-term contracts, as well as in order to get solar in this country, you need to have a FICO credit score of 650 or 700 and above. I know some of the students may not have credit scores yet. Can you tell me how many people don't have a FICO credit score over 700 in this country? Yes, percentage. It's actually over half of the country. Does 55% doesn't have a FICO credit score of 700. So even though community solar has no upfront cost and is you just pay a monthly subscription fee that's at a discount from what you're currently paying your utility, 55% of the country cannot get community solar right now. So how much do you guys know about FICO credit scores? It's okay if you don't know anything. I didn't know anything before. Nothing. Okay. So FICO credit scores are fascinating in that they don't measure whether you pay your utility bills on time. They don't measure whether you pay your rental bills on time. They kind of only measure if you pay your mortgage and your credit cards. And there are a lot of reasons why people in this country don't have high FICO scores. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not paying their utility bills on time. In fact, if you have a mortgage of $500,000, you will have a higher FICO score than someone who doesn't have a mortgage and is just paying their rent on time every month. So again, our FICO credit score system, which determines much of your fate in this country, whether you can get a car, whether you can get an apartment, whether you can get solar, this is actually disproportionately hurting low to moderate income Americans. So I mentioned financing innovations that allow us to put solar in the hands of low-income populations. The Department of Energy gave us a grant, and we're working on finding an alternative qualification standard. Rather than relying on FICO, which is an imperfect, blunt instrument, we're using a special algorithm that's based on a few metrics, but primarily focused on the utility repayment history of a customer. So if you pay your utility bill on time, you will pay your community solar bill on time. That's our premise. And we're proving that out with our grant by the Department of Energy. So that's what we call the energy score on the bottom there. And the other thing we've been working towards is offering short-term contracts. Those 20-year contracts with cancellation fees is not going to work for anyone. It's a miracle, but we've signed up people because they really want community solar and they think they'll move in 20 years, but that's not how we'll scale this. And so we just 2 weeks ago launched our first project in New York that has a shorter term contract. It's 6 years, but it has no cancellation fee. So 6 years, no cancellation fee, a big step forward, means that people can get out of their contract with no penalty as long as they give us a 2-month warning. And we've pushed for that for a year and a half. Imagine where we'll get in another year. So that's how we get access to low to moderate income Americans. And do you guys know why there are 20-year contracts in solar? So one of the reasons is because that's just how solar has always been financed. It comes down to the financiers and their needs to make returns, and they need guaranteed 20-year returns on their investment. Remember, community solar doesn't have an upfront cost, which means customers are not bearing the cost of installing the farm. So the financiers are bearing the upfront cost of installing the farm, and they want to guarantee get paid over 20 years. But the thing is, and what makes community solar so great, is that you're not dealing with the 20-year risk. You're dealing with a month, maybe a couple months risk. Because in community solar, if someone defaults, you're not left with a stranded asset on their roof you can never get back. If someone defaults with community solar, you can just swap someone out for their spot. So the risk is not 20 years, it's a couple months. So what we are doing is raising a loan loss reserve through philanthropy to prove that the risk of serving low to moderate income Americans, the perceived risk is greater than the real risk. And when you take data and you prove that hypothesis, when you take data and you prove that FICO credit scores are not as accurate as our energy score, you can actually blow up the market for millions more Americans to access solar. And this is using pure market means. But we just have to take the risk ourselves that no one else is willing to take because they're very conservative. Does that make sense? So the value proposition of community solar, it really is a win-win-win for everyone. I can break down the economics for you if you'd like, but on the solar developer side, they are saving money in their customer acquisition costs. Those crippling customer acquisition costs that I told you about, they're actually going up and up over time for solar developers. And the reason why that customer acquisition cost is going up and up over time is because we've picked all the low-hanging fruit of people that can put solar on their home. Everyone who wants solar and can afford it pretty much already has it, right? So now we're left selling solar to people who cannot put it on their roof or don't care about solar, and that is expensive. So the households that can't get solar, this is their chance to access clean energy at a discount for the first time in their lives. And the average family saves about $200 a year. It's not a ton of money, but for my family actually growing up, that would have been a lot for us. And there are a lot of families across the country for which $200 a year could be used for very substantial other costs. And then the planet, it goes without saying, I think we can all get behind. It's good for the planet, more solar in the world. We can decarbonize our economy and make sure that we're creating a clean energy system that works for all of us and not just some of us. So just really quickly to wrap up on our work, we've worked on 14 projects throughout Massachusetts, DC, New Jersey. We just expanded to New York. New York is the area of the greatest growth right now. And to the extent you've been following Massachusetts regulations, has anyone been following Massachusetts solar regulations? Yeah, you're probably better off for it. But the regulations have changed a lot in the past years. And so Massachusetts will have fits and starts in putting more solar in the ground because there are quotas across the state about where solar can be installed. And those quotas get met real quick, especially in the greater Boston area. And so every year they have to change the regulations as a compromise with the utilities who are not that solar friendly at the moment, but they are getting there. We've worked with it's not just households that we've plugged into community solar farms. We've also plugged in corporations like Etsy and a Fortune 100 company we can't talk about right yet. But we're plugging in their data centers into community solar farms. And then once the corporation plugs in, the employees plug in as well. Or once we plug in a church into a community solar farm, like the Unitarian Church we just plugged into in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, then the congregation signs up for their home. So this is what I'm talking about how solar is contagious. And if you rally people around their community and get their communities to sign up together, this is how we spread solar to the mainstream. Are you guys interested in our team? I can gloss over this. So this is the vision we have for America. Okay. Yeah. No, sure. I mean, the font's a little messed up, but we have a year ago, exactly a year ago, we had 5 people on our team. Now we have 17. So it's still small, but it feels like it's grown a lot. And our team is comprised of engineers and sales professionals and marketing and writers. And basically, you know, a lot of what we do is community education. Most people have never heard of community solar. They had no idea it exists. And so much of our job is just telling people it's out there, it's not a trap, and it can actually help you save money on your electricity bills. My co-founder is an investment banker from Barclays, 6 years in New York and London. I myself worked in the Obama campaign, the first one, and then I worked in the Obama administration on policy. And then I lived in India and Pakistan for a couple of years working on renewable energy companies and solar companies. It's kind of a random, non-linear route. If you guys have questions about just following your passions and not necessarily chasing a career, I can answer that too. And we have a lead engineer who comes from MIT, has worked in 10 years on the software side. But my favorite thing about our job is the company and the people, the team in it. And to be good at community solar, you really need to know 3 things. You need to know communities, you need to know energy policy, and you need to have technology that can scale across the country. So we have the technology that's, you know, written by the software engineers from MIT. We have worked on writing policy at the White House ourselves, so we have a good idea of how to navigate the regulatory system. And we're taking the community organizing lessons I mentioned from the Obama campaign and bringing it to making solar spread to the masses. So that's kind of a little bit more about our team. Happy to talk any more if you want about it. And then our vision really is of America where solar blankets our cities and towns, where anyone can get solar regardless of their income, regardless of the type of roof they own. And so much of our lives are determined by the birth lottery, right? How we were born, where we were born, what family we were born into, what education we could get. And there's a fundamental injustice about that, just as there is a fundamental injustice about who can access clean energy in the country right now. And so our work is about making a more just and equitable world in energy and using community solar to do that one step at a time. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Is this by people who are living in like New York and the Massachusetts area, since that's where it's like you're expanding to?
Yeah, so that's where we have our current projects that we're putting on the platform. But what's great about what we're developing is that in this next month, we're launching our online marketplace. And the goal is for it to be the online marketplace for the entire nation for community solar. Whether we're on the ground working on those projects or not, we want people to be able to put in their zip code and see if there's a solar garden that serves them all across the country. And even in those states that don't have community solar laws, outside of those 16 states, there are states where the utilities are taking the lead on community solar, and so that could be an option on the marketplace too. So that's a big, I mean, I'm actually raising a seed round right now to hire the tech talent to increase our reach across the country. But that's a big goal of ours in the next year.
How are you doing in Maine?
We don't operate in Maine. We've been invited, there's a good question back there, but we were invited to work on a couple of projects about 2 years ago, but from what I haven't followed Maine's community solar since that time, but what I understand is that they met their solar quotas. They couldn't install more. Maybe you have more information. Huh? Yeah. Oh, that's the tagline of every day.
Have you faced any backlash from already existing like non-renewable energy companies?
You mean oil and gas companies?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oil and gas companies are not as threatened by solar companies in the solar industry as much as investor-owned utilities are. Investor-owned utilities. Have you talked about the death spiral in these talks before? The utility death spiral. If you Google it, it's fascinating reading. But The idea is that utilities have been slow to embrace renewable energy and innovation, generally speaking, right? And if they don't do that soon, they'll continue to go on this trend that they've been on, where they'll get fewer and fewer revenues every year because people are leaving and embracing other sources of renewable energy. So the idea is that the utilities have so far spent a lot of money lobbying against the solar industry. So right now it's a zero-sum game. If one wins, the other loses. But we need to reimagine a world where we can work together. So we're actually trying to talk to utilities right now about a potential community solar partnership.
I was wondering, since you guys have really started with a really kind of limited scope, well, not that limited, but looking at one specific region of America, I guess my question is more about extrapolating this to an international context.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak maybe a little bit about the development of solar energy in developing nations across the world where people really could use an energy source that is not fossil fuels, and how to I don't know, implement that? Yeah.
So I used to work on renewable energy in India and Pakistan, and the interesting thing so microgrids are fascinating, right? You go to the middle of nowhere, a place where you have to take a plane 4 hours, and then an overnight train 15 hours, and then you drive for another 4 hours, and then you're in the rural villages of India. And they have microgrids out there. They're working on getting solar to everyone, but the price per watt out on those really far off microgrids is really high. It's actually higher than conventional energy would be in the city. So there's a real big rural urban divide. And then in countries where people don't necessarily, they struggle for a consistent source of energy, and they're pretty agnostic as to the source, right? They just want a reliable, cheap source of energy. And actually, if we talk about utilities motivations, those are utilities motivations too. They just want the most reliable, cheapest source of energy. They don't care the source. And so it's our responsibility, right, to create innovations that make renewable energy the cheapest and the most reliable sources. Because it's hard to justify, I'm all for more renewable in the world, but it's hard to voice those costs on a village that can't pay for it. So what we work on is making the distribution and financing innovations in the renewable energy world. I'm convinced that it comes down to two things: distribution and financing innovations, right? When you graph what a poor person makes in a developing emerging economy, it's not that they're earning $2 a day, which is what you hear about all the time as the poverty line, right? They're not down here. They're actually their income patterns are very staggered, and they spike. So on average, they make $2 a day, but that's just not how they make money, right? They'll go through periods of no income, and then it'll spike. And so we have to align our electricity payments to that kind of income generation pattern, right? And that's a financing innovation. Companies like M-Copa, which allow people to pay on their phone and pay in small amounts for electricity they're using solar, is actually more important than the solar innovation itself. I mentioned the plane ride to the train ride to the car ride, right? It's really, my biggest lesson from working in India is that it's really expensive to get out to some of these communities. And so we have to empower locals to be the distribution network as opposed to us going out there ourselves. So I worked with d.light Solar, which is a solar lantern company. It's not microgrids, but in order to sell solar lanterns to replace diesel and replace the need for diesel or the danger of diesel, you have to make it cheap enough for people to buy in far-flung villages. And the only way to do that is to get locals to sell it, not for us to send our salespeople out there. So as unsexy as financing and distribution is, it is the heart of how we get renewable energy to the developing world. And then speaking about community solar in the developing world, Brazil just passed a community solar law. Mexico just passed a community solar law. Europe has done a lot of work with community wind. But again, it's only really until now that we haven't been able to offer community solar or solar at a discount. It's always been at a premium. And you need for community solar to work, you need a good grid. Many emerging economies don't have a good, stable grid. So community solar is a way to increase access, but it's not necessarily for the poorest developing countries in the world.
I have a question back. So I know Tufts built a big solar farm on their Grafton campus, and it's going to be knocking off a lot of the needs of the Grafton campus, but it doesn't spill over to this campus because it's not big enough. So I'm interested in scales. Like, what would it mean for Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Tufts to sort of buy into a community-supported solar? Does it exist? What would it take to happen to have it be at the institutional level, not at the household level?
Yeah, so MIT just bought a lot of power from a big shared solar farm that is operating, I think, in either North Carolina or Virginia, somewhere down there, not in Massachusetts. And right now, there are geographic restrictions on community solar. You have to be in the same utility zone as your solar garden, meaning there are 6 utility load zones in Massachusetts. So just imagine you have to be in the same 1/6 of Massachusetts as your solar garden. So it could be 30 miles away from you. It doesn't have to be in your town, but there is that geographic constraint at the moment. This is all coming down to regulations, both federal and state policy. If we can find a way to allow people to tap into solar gardens that aren't in their current state, then that will be a way to scale. It's also, community solar is the best path to scaling residential solar, because putting solar on people's individual households, many of which the roofs are not big enough to power their own home, that's not a path to scale. And so the whole sharing economy is based on this idea that we take resources that are good for community solar and we let everyone tap into them. So ideally, you could have a solar farm in a suburban area that urban communities could tap into. So that's kind of the idea. MIT worked out a special, I actually have to find out more information, but I'm pretty sure you can go across state lines if you work with utilities directly and you have a partnership with the utilities. That in and of itself is obviously hard to do on an individual household level. So there's further innovation to happen here, to do here, and there's a lot of work. It's not just one company that's going to solve it, and we all have to work together to kind of figure out these geographic constraints.
So it was very similar to the question that you asked, and you kind of already answered it. I was going to ask about if, say, we reach 100% people can use solar power. Are there enough solar panels that can support everybody, or what needs to happen? Maybe an expansion of these farms, like more land is going to be needed. Do you foresee in the future maybe each solar panel is going to be strong enough to support more than one person, more than one owner?
Yeah. So a lot of questions in that, but
sorry.
No, that's good. So there is enough land in the U.S. to power everyone using solar, right? And solar is the special renewable energy source. It's everywhere, it's abundant, it's free, and it's renewable. So as opposed to hydro or biogas, those aren't everywhere. And so it has the potential to power people everywhere, but you do have to either figure out regulatory innovation around getting around state lines, where you could build a ton of solar farms in Texas and Nevada, and we here in Massachusetts could plug into those, right? That's kind of the ideal future. Or a more efficient peer-to-peer sharing network. There's a company called LOC3, and they are operating in Brooklyn, and they're using blockchain to have peer-to-peer sales of electricity, meaning someone is producing electricity on their own home, and they're selling it on the blockchain to another person that wants to buy cheaper electricity. And this is what people talk about as the future of distributed energy, right? We're not just buying power from utilities. We're not just buying power directly from power suppliers. We can buy power from each other, and that increases efficiencies as long as you have the technology that can back that securely. So blockchain is a topic that's really, do you guys know what blockchain is, by the way? Okay, blockchain is the technology that makes Bitcoin possible. All the cryptocurrencies you hear about, blockchain is a technology that allows, that basically it's a secure ledger, like a ledger as in accounting, secure electronic ledger of anything that uses transactions. And it's more secure than anything else you can find, any other kind of technology you can find. And it's more secure because it's the way new information is written is a chain that's on top of the chain of transactions that have already happened. So in order, you can't hack that because it's a transparent chain that's available to everyone, but the information is more secure. That was a terrible explanation of blockchain. You should Google it. But the more you will hear, once you know or hear about blockchain, you will hear about it all the time in your life now. And all the technological investments and VC money, a lot of it is going to blockchain technologies, and it's applicable to all industries. Look that up as a way to further scale.
So actually, I would like to build up on the two last questions. So as long as we cannot cross state lines or sell peer-to-peer, can you talk a little bit more about the location of these farms in urban areas where competition for space is very high?
Yeah.
What kind of locations are they using to build those that are big enough to support something like this?
Yeah. I mean, so again, the goal is to put solar farms in areas that are good for solar and then let people tap into that. And it's still very applicable for within state lines. So for Boston, for example, a project we worked on that served the greater Boston area was actually built in Dover. So Dover's not that far from Boston, but it is miles away, and it has a lot of farmland. So they actually built the farm on top of a landfill, and people could plug into it. So where we find farms are most often located is landfills and actual agricultural farms that either need their land to remain fallow for some time so that they can, invigorate itself or get nutrients back so they can have future agricultural production later. Or they're farms that don't want to use the land for something. They don't want to use it for food production, but they still want to monetize their land. So often you'll see more and more farms becoming solar farms because it's a way for the farm to monetize their land and keep going, because farming, the margins on farming are increasingly lower. So in cities, the idea is to have the area outside the cities where there are land be used for solar farms, and then the cities could tap into it. Actual cities, you'll see community solar pilots on community centers like churches, where the congregants of the church can plug into it. It can't probably serve the whole congregation with a church roof, but those in aggregation can make up a lot of capacity.
Thank you for a very engaging presentation. I have a kind of a historical question.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago, everyone was talking about solar film, and solar film that could go on windows and on roofs without the sort of big superstructure. I see solar backpacks running around, but I haven't seen anything else recently. Do you happen to know anything about what's going on with that?
Yeah, the efficiency of those panels, basically the camping solar panels you can take with you, they don't work well if it's at all cloudy. It has to be direct sunlight on it, and so the efficiency of them aren't very good. So that's why solar lanterns will work, but anything bigger scale than that, it's not cheap enough, or the efficiency is not good enough to actually make it produce meaningful amounts of power. Tesla obviously announced last year that there's new solar panels on homes, or actual roof tiles, right? And that they're expensive. Not everyone can enjoy them, but that's, I think, the wave of the future. And there are a couple companies where windows and window blinds are made out of solar panels that are coming out. It's just none of them are cheap enough, and the efficiencies aren't good enough yet to produce power, to have meaningful power come from it. Yeah.
Nice to hear your speech, and I have a couple of questions about your I have two questions. First, do you face any regulation by the electricity provider, like National Grid, limit your size, or 1 megawatt in size, in scale? And I wonder, is there any regulation about that? And also, I wondered, do you cooperate with some battery company, because solar energy is so intermittent?
Mm-hmm. So the beauty of communities, I'm going to take your second question first. The beauty of community solar is that it goes to the grid, so it doesn't actually require, the intermittent nature of solar is less of a problem for individual solar developers. But yes, so, storage is the wave of the future. It's just that solar plus storage is too expensive now. People would be paying more as opposed to be paying less. So it is the wave of the future. It'll happen likely in the next decade, depending on how quickly Tesla can produce batteries cheaper. But we're not there yet, and community solar doesn't talk about storage, but that's how we'll really actually blow up the use of solar in the world, is if we can get storage, particularly for your developing world question. And then your first question is about regulations around size of solar farms. So the typical solar farm, community solar farm, is 1 megawatt. So that serves about 150 people, takes a couple of acres to build, so you need a pretty big amount of space, to your question, and it serves 150 people. It costs about $3 million to build. And there's not really regulations. Utilities are required in states that say you can benefit from solar that's not on your own roof, like Massachusetts. Utilities are required to work and credit your bills with solar that you purchase from another provider. So there are regulations about how big a solar farm can be, but that's determined by state-by-state legislation.
Can you say something about the materials that are used to make the panels, and as the technologies improve over time, what we're going to be doing with all these solar panels? I mean, I don't understand what they're made of. Are they made of plastic? Are they made of
Generally, PVs are made of silicon, and I mean, so generally speaking, we partner with solar developers that only have a very clean supply chain of panels, right? So there's a lot of, if you look at critics of solar, there's a lot of talk about solar, the process of developing solar, manufacturing solar panels, depending on where they're manufactured, depending on labor standards, is actually harmful, not helpful to the environment. And so it's really important to, when you look for a vendor for your rooftop solar farm, if you look for a partner solar developer, to know where their panels come from. And then there's a whole big discussion around how do you recycle the panels, because these farms their shelf life on paper is 20 years, but it's actually closer to 30 years. And then the panels get recycled, but you have to also we work with solar developers that have a recycling program to make sure that chemicals from the solar panel don't harm the environment.
So I have one last question. If you could just reflect on your time as an undergrad and sort of what your major was, what you were thinking as you finished, as you were starting to think about launching your career. Were there particular classes you wanted to take because you kind of knew you were going to be in energy somehow? I would love to have you just reflect on that.
I am sorry to disappoint you, but I didn't study energy or environmental studies in my undergrad, which means that you can change your career anytime. I was a history major and an international studies major, and I really wanted to work in national security, and so my dream was to work in the National Security Council on international foreign policy. And I actually discovered energy when I achieved my dream. I was working in the National Security Council on Middle East policy, and then I was in Yemen. We were driving through Yemen in an armored car, and looking out the window, we were working all on counterterrorism, drone stuff, and then I would look out the window, and all I'd see is people were lined up waiting for fuel, that they couldn't live their basic life because they couldn't get access to fuel, and how I didn't feel like I was working on these security issues, but I didn't feel like I was helping people's ordinary day-to-day life. And energy is that, right? Energy is a way to affect every single person on a level that's of necessity. And so that's why I transitioned to renewable energy. I would say that more applicable to you guys as you're thinking about your careers in energy, I would say think about, there's so many ways to work in energy, and many of them are business driven, but not all of them are. And so I would really think less about what technology you want to align yourself with, but more about what do you want your functional role to be. Are you a salesperson? Do you like spreading the word to others? Are you a people person? Then sales will always be, for every single energy company out there, that's a dire need. Analytics and obviously programming. That an understanding of big data is a huge need that will be applicable to any energy company, and as well as like digital marketing analytics. That's increasingly lucrative for people in this space. Otherwise, do you want to do policy and advocacy? Do you want to go and make the laws that even make all of this happen, right? Think functionally about what are your skills, what do you like to do, rather than what is the perfect company and what is the perfect technology to align yourself with.
Thank you, Steph. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.